就喜欢。我就说废话，我说你说的 India was kind of as a place to go。我说那 India is那个 British imperialism in India。
不是，但是他最开始有一个开了，我不应该是一个开了。Oh, sure. Yeah, it's a crazy end of semester. Yeah.
No, I saw your body. No, I was something else. Because I see, but I somehow specifically see my point about the work and talent. I become nothing but somebody who speaks about China working together. And so that's another effective way of marginalization. Yes. No, really. Everybody now calls me as working together. Although I have some outstanding. Oh yeah. Also, when I was young, had that lovely passage about the role of Elle magazine, the transnational. That is, theoretically like a hypothesis. Somebody should write a PhD. Really? Yeah. I had an amazing.
No, I mean I think that forming that.
Oh yeah. And also, the way we look at the Chinese countryside, so that it becomes like a tourist game. So I felt that there was kind of usually I spend people time. But maybe you just don't know.
写一本书讲我的印的研究，然后再写文化。
Her Wallace, yes, that's what we did. Yes, I'm sorry that didn't work out. I know you didn't make an offer to her. Can I call you one name? Or?
Yeah, sure. And I invited you.
never left the business for a while. And then, like, in the last month, I've done nothing. So I can take it.
Well, so I don't know what it is.
It is what it is. But it is,
I can't make it smaller.
you know, I was just curious to say what it cost me, but I don't think it's anything to do with that. Hello? Oh, it's really, that is extremely, that could be, you know,
Is it on? Oh, okay. Well, good afternoon. Welcome back. Welcome to the second panel discussion. And my name is Jay Wang. I'm a faculty member at USC Annenberg and teach in the areas of strategic communication and public diplomacy. We have 4 distinguished guests as panelists. And let me first briefly introduce them. Zhengrong Hu is Professor of Communication at Communication University of China, and Professor Hu is also Vice President of the university. And Bingchun Meng is a lecturer of Media and Communication Studies at London School of Economics. And Professor Zhao, probably all of you know by now, is a Professor of Communication at Simon Fraser University. And Monroe Price is the Director of the Center for Global Communication Studies at our sister program, we would call it brother program. Actually, in Chinese, it should be brother program, right? 兄弟院校 as opposed to sister program. At the Annenberg School for Communication at University of Pennsylvania. Well, by the way, Philadelphia is the city of the brotherly love. So, okay. Let me repeat the rules for this panel. It's the same as the last panel. We'll have 10 minutes for each of them to give their brief remarks or presentations, and followed by some discussion. I will give a little privilege to invited participants first for comments and questions, and before we'll open up the discussion to everybody on the floor. I'm also going to exercise a little bit executive privilege or power that's given to me as a moderator. I would ask Professor Hu to go first, and Bingchun second, and Professor Zhao third, and Monroe Price last. So why don't we start with, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And since we only have the 10 minutes, so I really want to use the PowerPoint and to show my my arguments. Sorry. Okay, I was asked to talk about media, especially broadcasting media change in China from the structural reconstruction or restructuring perspective. So I really want to talk about that. But first of all, I really want to go very, very, very quickly through the reality happened in the past few years, especially currently in China, in terms of this broadcasting media structural consolidation. Because I definitely believe that if you want to do research, especially in China, that you have to heavily rely on the first-hand reality, especially the insider information. Because in China, not everything is transparent. Not everything is, and especially the evidence is published to the whole society. So the most important thing for Chinese studies, in my view, is try to understand China from the first hand, especially from insider understanding of the situation and also the reality. Okay, concerning Chinese broadcasting media structural consolidation, there are something happened which started several years ago, actually more than 10 years ago, but actually have lasted until the current until now, and even for the next few years. The first structural sort of transformation is, we usually call that, in Chinese we usually call that fen, separation, which means separation. And this separation just happens in 2 different fields. Regulator separated from the operator. In Chinese we usually call that 管办分离. That means 广电局 should be separated from the broadcasters. And because in China right now they are the same body. And then second, we should call that 制播分离, which is quite popular in Western world, but in China it's quite new phenomenon. And content production separated from broadcasters. And this kind of fen has been enforced since the very beginning of this year. And then consolidation, which we usually call that 和. And this he and this consolidation also has double meanings. The first means happened in the media circles. We should call that media convergence, which is very popular everywhere in the world. So I don't want to spend time. And then consolidation of the government authorities, which is quite new to Chinese government regulators. All of those happens, just we can find some new, quite latest phenomenon happened in China since the very beginning of this year. For example, like Shanghai 广播电视台, Shanghai 传媒集团, SMG has already changed to the new name or rename its the organization called Shanghai Broadcasting Station. And not only the behavior of renaming, but also the behavior of reconstruction or restructuring of its whole organizational structure, and also will lead to the very different consequences. And this is happened. That happened at the middle level, at the media level, but at the level of the government authorities or regulators, all of us know that in China, different regulators are regulating different media sectors. But actually this year, this behavior and this policy has been carried out and has been speeded up. And at the provincial level, especially at the municipal level and county level, different regulators at different levels have been merged very quickly. And for example, like, sorry for not translation, I already got some information from not only from Jiangsu, but also from Hunan, which is a leading local broadcasters in China, and also Zhejiang and also Sichuan. All of those are very highly developed broadcasters in China. They have undertaken this kind of latest policy or carry out this kind of latest policy, for example, like this kind of separation, this kind of consolidation. Okay, try to go very quickly through this to save up the time. And but if you are interested in this kind of detailed and precise transformation, we can spare a little bit of time afterwards. But on research, especially on Chinese media and communication research, my own research area is media policy and institutional transition. And this area has been becoming one of more and more dominant and more noteworthy among Chinese communication researchers and scholars. Not only because several reasons, not only because media policy and institutional transition is very significant for media, because so far we can say that policy obstacle or institutional issues is the biggest, actually our biggest obstacles for whole Chinese media transformation or media reform. But also for societies, this kind of policy and institutional arrangement also has becoming the main obstacle for this kind of informationization of whole China. And also this current policy system will definitely lead to the much more social stratified and so on. And also for politics, this kind of policy system and also institutional transition is one of the core parts or core considerations for Chinese Communist parties to keep this political system sustainable and stable. Because the ideology control is one of the top considerations for the Communist Party historically. And so along with this way, I really want to give some points. The first point is in the past 3 decades, and actually each step of Chinese media has moved or has undertaken is greatly the consequence of the changes in media policy and institutional change. Okay, 3 minutes left. And the second point is Chinese media policy and institutional transition just has taken place in Chinese context. Please remember this. But of course, we have a lot of external influences from the Western world. For example, like media conglomeration. We have no this idea in Chinese called 集团化, no Chinese 集团化. But after mid-1990s, we borrowed this idea, we borrowed these measures from FCC's new telecom acts, actually happened in the United States. And then third point is about this kind of issues. In China, media policy and also institutional transition is closely related with Chinese political system. That means it will be, or they will be definitely or ultimately determined by Chinese political governance structure and also political system. And also this kind of value, cultural values. And the last point I really want to mention is this kind of research has drawn a lot of attentions, not only in academic research, academic communities, but also policymakers and media professionals, because their behavior and their professional, even we call that professionalism, is heavily influenced by this kind of, by current system, policy system and so on. So within this area, I really want to suggest that there are several key issues which could be very fundamental for Chinese media studies and communication studies. Actually, not only for Chinese media studies, but for Chinese studies. Okay, the first key issue is about value foundation or ideological basis for Chinese media policy making and institutional transition. Actually, this is a very, very macro level questions. What kind of China or what kind of society is China leading to? That is a very, very ideological foundation-based or value system-based, and how to lead China to this kind of direction. And okay, for example, like Chinese Communist Party really wants to put this into the core part of the whole political value system called harmonious society, like these 6 points. You can quickly look through. All of those is quite a sort of hybrid, something borrowed from Western words, especially terminologies sense. Something is quite moral or morality based, something like Confucius philosophy and so on. And the second key issue is sorry, no time, but I really want to still use, 1 minute. Okay, still, what the other key issue is this kind of interest groups or interest players. Because in China, we can, Chinese policy, not Chinese political system and political Communist Party is not centralized as before. So in China, we can find a lot of different players among whole Chinese media policy making and institutional transition areas. For example, like localism, departmentalism, and sectorism. That's why in China we can find a lot of conflicts between the soft and the telecoms, and a lot of conflicts between the press and Xinhua News Agency and soft and so on, and at local levels. And the third key issue would be this kind of interrelationships between Chinese political governance transformation and media policy and regulatory system. Okay, finally, we can find that we really borrow a lot of Western paradigms, not only terminologies, theories, methods, into Chinese media studies and communication research, especially, for example, like public interests, public options, public policy making, those kind of terminologies, and also institutional economics, new institutional economics, and so forth. Those kind of theories are also have been implied into this kind of research. And also a lot of more critical research, schools like political economy have also been utilized in Chinese, this kind of research. But honestly, these kind of paradigms used in Chinese communication and media studies are very, very significant, sometimes, to some extent, in explaining Chinese cases. But my view is Chinese reality is on the other path or on the other way. So just as some scholars mentioned before, that we in Chinese case that we are very, very cultural contextual, especially the political culture is this kind of context is quite not unique, it's quite different from the others. And also this kind of social contingency and so on. So if we ask whether in China there is already emerging Chinese models of media policy and institutional transition studies, my answer is so far no. And so that's very interesting. It's sort of very contradictory or contradictory to Judy's argument that actually Chinese communication studies actually is starting from somewhere. That means we borrow so many things from Western words like terminologies, like methodologies, like paradigms and theories, to currently to nowhere. Is it Chinese? No. Is it Western theories applied to understanding and explain China? So sometimes I find it's a very interesting case. One of the most interesting cases is many Chinese scholars in China really like to use postmodern theories to analyze pre-modern China, which is very interesting.
Okay, Professor Hu, I have to interrupt you and hold a thought. We start from somewhere to question mark nowhere, and we'll come back and we'll have a discussion. Thank you very much. And next we have Dr. Meng from the London School of Economics.
Okay, I was assigned to talk about new media research, and since I probably know a little bit more about internet research in China, internet research on China, so I'll just focus on that aspect rather than other types of new media. Now, from the very beginning, I think the diffusion of the internet in China has been scrutinized for its political implications. And there have been several analyses of academic research focusing on internet in China, including one that Jack and Joseph Chen did. Several of these studies consistently shown that the political implications of the internet in China seem to be the #1 priority on the agenda of researchers. Issues related with democracy and human rights, and especially for those located outside of China, they seem to be particularly eager to detect any democratizing potential of these new media. And I think, and this is hardly surprising given the ostensibly tension between a decentralized and decentralizing digital network and the world's largest remaining authoritarian regime. But what I want to do here is to probably be a little polemic and talk about what are the problems if we examine internet in China only through the preformed lens of democratization. So that's why I put the title "Moving Beyond Democratization" about the agenda on China's internet research. I think empirically, this preformed lens of democratization, this could lead to oversimplification of the very diverse activities taking place in Chinese cyberspace, many of which do not pursue any overt political agenda. And theoretically, I think the democratization framework entails a rather limited view of both politics and the role of media in communication. Within this framework, I think politics is understood as being directly related to state power, which can be either challenged or reinforced by new communication technologies. And the function of the internet, on the other hand, is perceived as being mainly instrumental. It provides information or communication space that is not available through other media channels. So what I did in this paper, and obviously I don't have time to go through all the details, so I'll probably skip some of the empirical evidence I proposed here and only raise some of the main talking points. What I did was that I first discussed some of the major limitations of the democratization perspective on the Chinese internet. I then introduced the concept of mediation as an alternative approach to framing China internet studies. And here I borrow Roger Silverstone's elaboration that mediation is a fundamentally dialectic notion which requires us to address the processes of communication as both institutionally and technologically driven and embedded. Actually, it's a quick remark that when Professor Pan was talking about articulation and rearticulation, it strikes me that there are a lot of parallels in terms of how we use either mediation or articulation to critique what's the problem with current research and in framing the future research agenda. And I don't know if this has to do with the fact that both terminology were developed by UK-based scholars who are supposedly know nothing but speculation. So first of all, I think the question of whether Internet will democratize China implies an essentially Western-centric view that treats China as the inscrutable yet inferior other waiting to be converted to quote-unquote one of us. And this is not to deny the universal appeal of democracy as a desirable goal for China to pursue, but to acknowledge the bias embedded in many research on political aspects of the Chinese Internet. For example, some of the research on the success and failure of the so-called Great Firewall is no more than a continuation of Cold War mentality, which conceives digital technology as the newest weapon to conquer the enemy. Just like previously with satellite TV, which was lauded by Rupert Murdoch as being able to tumble any authoritarian regime, now the hope is put on the Internet to provide the so-called free flow of information. Yet for one thing, the liberal democratic thinking that conflates freedom of speech with democracy is problematic in itself. And for another, the democratization framework entails the neglect of China's past and present. China's, as Professor Zhao has pointed out, China's revolutionary past has rendered authoritarian state historically grounded legitimacy. Hence, one should not assume an antithetical relationship between the regime and the Chinese people. And second, I think the democratization approach takes a rather limited view on power and control. And I think this sort of resonates with what Colin was suggesting earlier, that we need to abandon the idea of unitary control. I think in the democratization model, the power and control is believed to only rest with the state. But I think when it comes to China, although censorship might be the most obvious form of information control, but it's far from being the only form. For example, among the four modalities of control that Lawrence Lessig identified in his discussion of cyberspace, namely law, market, norm, and architecture, the majority of which don't have to be exerted by the state. In fact, the unequal power distribution infuses both structural and processual aspects of new media, hence the inequality of accessing and utilizing information. And thirdly, I think closely related with this limited view on power, the democratization approach also entails a narrow understanding of politics, which focuses on the formal politics of the state. However, if we recognize the multiple sides of power struggle, the exercise of politics also proliferates. I would skip a case study I raised here. And I think last but not least, the democratization approach tends to brush over the experience of average Internet users in terms of how they negotiate mediated communication space on a daily basis. So then I would move on to briefly talk about what do I see as the relevancy of this notion of mediation and how this could help us frame some of the questions with regard to future research agenda. I think moving beyond an instrumental approach that focuses on the impact or influence of the Internet on Chinese society, I find the sociological term mediation helpful in conceiving a more comprehensive research agenda. And this notion, elaborated by Roger Silverstone, he was actually building upon the work of Thompson and Martin Barbero. He calls media scholars' attention to this fundamentally dialectic notion, and he elaborates that mediation requires us to understand how processes of communication change the social and cultural environments that supports us, as well as relationships that participants, both individual and institutional, have to that environment and to each other. At the same time, it requires a consideration of the social as in turn a mediator. Institutions and technologies, as well as meanings that are delivered by them, are mediated in the social process of reception and consumption, end of quote. So I think the implications that this discussion have for China's internet research, I think, are as following. First, the institutional arrangements of internet in China, such as issues related with information infrastructure, copyright regulation, or censorship, are both embedded in and reshaping the specific Chinese context of political, economic, and social contentions. Attempts to control the internet come from various sources of power, including both the state and the market. Yet such control has to be constantly negotiated through technological features of the internet as a medium as well. And second, I think mediation also takes place at the symbolic level in terms of who gets to participate in the communication on the internet, how they represent themselves or being represented, and how such participation and representation feed back to inclusion or exclusion in the offline world, both local and global. For example, the much discussed topic of cyber nationalism invites our reflection not only on the historical, social, and cultural context that contributes to the emergence of such phenomena, but also how the nationalism discourses are mediated by the specific features of the internet to become either amplified or polarized. The voices, I think, that are silenced in this vociferous conversation are just as important as those accentuated. And third, as a means of communication that mediates lives of individuals, internet is not just opening up more space for interaction, but also contributes to the formation of new discursive modes and communicative practice. That is to say, news websites, online forums, chat rooms, and blogs don't simply extend offline communication into the virtual world. They may also change the ways in which conversations are conducted. And so these are just some very brief points I want to raise in terms of how can we conceive future research agenda. And needless to say, I think the mediating power of the internet at all three levels are closely connected. But on the other hand, I think it's impossible for us to read from one level of the process of mediation to another. For example, we can't really, the ownership issue doesn't necessarily determine content, and the content doesn't necessarily determine interpretation and consumption. And it is a very daunting challenge for researchers to connect these three levels in the contentious context of contemporary China. But I think maybe that's also what makes our work exciting. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Meng. Professor Zhao?
Being the docile, disciplined Asia labor I am, I didn't prepare PowerPoint, and also I'm going to just grab my paper and try to follow the 4 questions. Also, I just want to, for those people who are interested in my paper, actually, when I sent in my paper, I sent into the not to reply email address. So when I saw the paper on the web, I said, oh, my paper wasn't there. What's on was my previous paper. So now actually my real paper is on the net. I think it was there yesterday. So what I'm going to do is just quickly go through my answers to those 4 questions. And in the meanwhile, I'm trying to bring in some of the points in my paper. Actually, many of those are already made by various people. My answer to the question of whether there's an interest in my field, my answer is yes. Right now it's so exciting. There are so many generic communication scholars, that is, communication scholars who seem to not have a field specialization or country of origin, or in their own studies, mainly North American, European scholars are interested in China. At the same time, we have China scholars, very big name China scholars, discover media, and they have been writing a lot about Chinese media increasingly. So this is very exciting, I think. In terms of the quality, and actually before that I want to talk about quantity, because it's through my reading of the piece you and Ernie did that I realized that actually the kind of critical research I represent, or I think myself present, occupies about 1.2% of the entire body of the literature that's produced on Chinese communication studies.
Published in the journals, which is
yeah.
Sanctioned.
Right, published in journals, but also Western Chinese journals. So I know how marginal I am, and I'm speaking from that marginality. In terms of quality, I would say that it's very uneven. One of the things that occur to me is that a contradiction, really. On the one hand, communication has become so essential. People talk about informational capitalism, network society. And so communication scholars should have a lot to say, right? But at least in the area of China studies, I don't think within China, actually, communication scholars were not part of the major intellectual debates of the reform era. Outside China, and also in the field, I think many China scholars still write about Chinese media as if a whole body of communication-specific literature did not exist. I think that speaks a lot about the juniority of our own paradigm, but also maybe our own field, but maybe also the fact that our communication scholars ourselves are so media-centric. Therefore, our research questions so narrow, all that. So there's a lot for us to do. A couple of people have talked about the overt politicization, and I think this is definitely the case. And actually, one of the most proud things I did is one time when a young woman Chinese student approached me, say, she wants to do a news study, just like what I did. I said, please don't do that. Do the entertainment. Do the television shows. And actually, she wrote her dissertation. Now her first job was NYU. So I claim some impact on that. I think part of this is the liberal rationalist bias of the theoretical framework that shapes us, also the legacy of a Cold War, so everything seen as political. Also, at the same time, but I want to call attention to a depoliticization in Chinese communication studies, mostly, I would say, mainland Chinese communication studies, and towards a kind of technocratic and bureaucratic rationality. And I think part of reason, for good reason, that is Chinese scholars were rebelling against over-politicization of their studies, or against dogmatic Marxism. And so when communication studies, US type, mainstream, empirical, who sees what, that kind of thing was introduced to China, it was very attractive. It was almost a form of resistance. We've talked a lot about journalistic professionalism. I think it's important for us to be aware of the political economy and cultural politics of scholarship itself, because I think scholars, Chinese scholars, are also trying to use objective social scientific research to assert their own relative autonomy vis-a-vis the state, and of course to establish their middle class status. So another thing I feel so powerful, I sort of Pan's point. If the liberal literature or that literature is irrelevant, don't read it. I don't think it can be so easily go away, because even if you don't read it, the Chinese media is constantly pointing that. And I found my students, especially graduate students from China, they do not seem to have a framework, but actually, if you dig deeper, they have the neoliberal common sense. And even for myself, I found myself constantly writing against. So my first book is when people are saying marketization is going to lead democracy. I say, hey, wait a moment. So therefore, my first book. Then when that argument is being taken as a mainstream, say, oh yeah, media democratize, there's a state and market fusion. Then some people, even people who initially endorse the liberal idea, say now it's almost a complete fusion, total bureaucratic authoritarianism, total market authoritarianism. Then I said, no, wait a moment, there's the social struggle, and that's my second book is about. So I feel, in that sense, I don't think I've been very proactive because I'm writing against, and it's the power of that liberal narrative. In terms of where I am. What's my minutes? How many are left?
You see over there.
In terms of the most important questions, I'm for one, and I arguing that actually one of the most important understudied area and a bias in Chinese media study is the urban coastal bias. And I think this is not just China's problem, because an argument has been made that it is precisely the lack of communication power of the Chinese peasantry that make it possible for cheap labor. Well, those labors are not just by definition cheap, because the political system, including the lack of communication power of the Chinese rural areas, make that a cheap labor. Cheap labor fits into export-oriented model. That leads to the current economic imbalance between U.S. and China. So I would argue that the communication bias of the urban bias of Chinese communication system, and also by extension Chinese media studies were very, very fundamental. It lays on the entire world. It's the basis of the entire world political economy. So if you want to solve the world's problem, I think communication scholars has a lot to do to rebalance their own study. Also, another point I would try to look at is a lot of studies have document a lot about the domination, schemes of domination. And I think also many scholars have looked at the strategy of resistance. But I think with regard to the scheme of domination, there's a lot look at the state, less on other forms of power. In terms of resistance, I think there's a lot of documentation about the resistance of elite journalists, especially the ones who are willing to talk to Western researchers. And then the resistance of Chinese workers, farmers, some of those just erupt, right? A few months ago, some thousands of workers beat a capitalist manager to death in northeast China, right? But then people were, how come? What kind of ideological conscience is behind this work? What science of justice behind these people? What are the cultural resources they mobilize? What the network of communication they mobilize to do these kind of things? And I think communication scholars, of course, for various reasons, our own class bias, also the party state's control, make it very difficult for us to study those forms of resistance, both active and passive, in terms of use of media, reading, and also at critical moments like this, what kind of channel communication they use, right? So in that context, I know Colin earlier denied that, that he's a Maoist. I'm not worried about bringing back the theme of communication and class struggle, actually. In that context, I also think what's lacking in the study is focus on the intersection between class and nation, both nationalities as minority groups within China, and again, this issue just erupted to Tibet, Xinjiang, and then transnationally, the process of transnational class formation, and the question of is it the case that right now, for example, there's more common interest between the Chinese elite, especially what's being called the coastal, urban-based export economies benefited elite versus and some of the elite in the U.S. who benefit from this. Are there signs of this kind of transnational class alliances? If so, can Professor Pan help me to design an empirical study to test that kind of hypothesis in terms of media content, the flow of journalists, all that kind of thing? I'm just imagine. Also, another point I think is significant is, of course, the gender and the ethnic dimension of this. People, I think it's very simplistic to reduce, for example, the conflicts in Xinjiang and Tibet as a purely ethnic and a class issue. I see, that's the timing. Almost done. One more. I think it's important to look at the contradictions and tensions within the Chinese state. Again, Professor Hu actually talked a lot about that. And also the complex intersections between elite and popular discourses, and also between the official ideology and the actual practices. Okay, I will just go to the last question. I think the answer that, there's no difference or there is difference between Chinese and Western study, I'm not sure. I think it's important to make the argument that there are, from the point, I think there should be more China-specific problems. For example, like what I said earlier, the urban-rural division, for me, should be a starting point for a lot of communication research, at least for China. Right now, when half of the population is still rural, and unless you go from this linear teleology that everybody in the end move to the urban areas, I don't know what that will look like, then I think this point, right now, humanity has reached this half point, right? Half people in the urban, half people in the rural, but that's only half. There's still half of the population. So I think there should be a more uniquely, in that sense, Chinese way of defining communication questions that has global implications. Also, I think what's important is not Western way or Chinese way. I think it's the different theoretical frameworks. And talk about, for example, the mass events. The party call, the protest as mass events, which is a depoliticizing way of talking it. The liberal framework say this is a right discourse, human rights. But then there are a few, unconstructed socialists think, well, this is the continuation of China's century-long struggle for people's democracy. That's a very different framework. And what kind of theoretical framework we use to describe, this? The party is, apolitical. The liberals, civil rights, civil society formation, and then a few socialists say, hey, this is the Chinese struggle for realization of uniquely Chinese people's democracy. I think that has implications for how those events are understood. Also, I think there's a question that concerns the nature of the Chinese state, not only politically but culturally. For example, argument has made actually a scholar who visited here just a few days, not long ago, talk about the idea of China as a civilizational site. And for that, you have a lot of cultural implications to study Chinese communication. When I was writing the other article, I said, oh yes, the legacy of the socialist state, not just to be reduced to authoritarianism, but other dimensions. Now I think I have to reach even back to history, say the legacy of Chinese culture and pre-modern culture and its impact. For example, one of the most important things for me is the fascination on popular level about, Confucians. Television shows, Yu Dan, reading Confucians. And it's so popular. Why? And some people think that, that's what, can save China from capitalism. So I think there's a lot to be, in that sense, there's difference.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Professor Zhao. I think that time has been prolonged by your speed of speech with the same level of clarity that we've enjoyed from the other speakers. Finally, we have Professor Merrill Price.
I'm going to stand because I liked Professor Penn's idea of speaking from an extraterritorial point. And people have accused me of being extraterritorial in the past. So, and it also allows me to differentiate myself from this distinguished panel, which really understands a great deal about China culture. I read the idea of this panel in part to be about this structural transformation of communication studies, as in addition to the structural transformation of communication in China. And so I'd like basically to riff a little bit off of Hu Zhengrong and other people's discussions here in that way. That is to say, is there a structural transformation in communication studies? And if so, what is causing it, and how does it relate in a certain way to this panel discussion, this two-day discussion here at the University of Southern California? And here I'm very moved by the paper by Dean Wilson and Fan Jiang and other graduate students here on research on China, media, and communication, an overview, which really asks this question of whether or not there is a transformation. And I think it's a mixed result. It's really one of the things that struck me in looking at the paper was the dominance of vocabulary. That is to say, a kind of Western vocabulary to measure transformation. That is to say, is it this goes back to Dr. Hu's view of from somewhere to nowhere or to somewhere, which is what is the origin of the transformation? What are the foundational goals? And then what are the kinds of objectives of such a transformation? And one of the interesting questions, I think, for example, is to look at publication records, the entrance of Chinese scholarship into world scholarship, and how that's defined and received. What are the standards for determining whether a scholar is a good scholar, is tenurable, is advanceable, et cetera, and the extent to which it depends on the particular standards of Western publication standards, except for Larry, who's the most Catholic of recipients of scholars and most understanding of geographical differences, if that's okay for me to say. Is it too? Well, at any rate, okay. This seems to me a great problem in terms of transformation. That is to say, determining what constitutes excellence, what constitutes the kind of rhythm and form of scholarship. So that would be one point that I'd make. The other question here is the role of ideology. Dr. Hu referred to this as well, which is to say, to what extent are departments in China and maybe departments in the United States or elsewhere somewhat related to ideologies, and how does a department become freed of ideologies, and is transformation dependent on a kind of structural change in who decides what the role of the party is, etc., in Chinese communications departments. A third point I wanted to make really relates to the people who are here at this session. Transformations have taken place because of individual pathways. It seems to me there's a really interesting study to be made of the kind of cultural development of leading scholars, like the scholars who are here, in terms of who was trained in a Chinese university at the bachelor level, obtaining PhDs in the West or in Europe, going to Australia, et cetera, and then going back to China. What's the rhythm of all this? In terms of the studies that are done, it seems to me one of the most interesting studies has to do with the culture of the professoriate as it emerges and as it develops, et cetera. And it's interesting to look at key loci for this development. Westminster's efforts under Colin Sparks' direction. I've been very interested in watching Jack Lin-Chuan-Q, who, again, because of his relationship to Annenberg, et cetera, and the China Internet Research Conference as a kind of vehicle for building a community of scholars across West and China who have a kind of longitudinal relationship. It's now, I think, in its 9th year, and who develop a kind of cohort and an ethics of scholarship as well. So one thing I would say in terms of areas for research that are important is this kind of institutional research of the institution itself. The other thing that has been interesting to me in my small forays has been the kind of stratification of journalism and communications departments. One of the really interesting things for a Westerner is to have this notion of what are the, quote, elite schools, and what makes a school an elite school. Is this a question of national reputation and power? Is it a question of intrinsic quality? Are there styles, etc., among these elite schools? Are the elite schools, how does competition among the elite schools contribute or deter transformation in communications departments? Here also, it's interesting to look at the different schools and their different evolutions, and that certainly has been interesting for me. I mean, I remember a visit to Tsinghua, and I was struck by entering the school to see the sign saying Omnicom School of Communication, and then going upstairs and seeing the Reuters workshop, the et cetera, this, you had sort of the commodification and marketization of a school of communication. Did this have an effect on the teaching? Does it alter what is deemed to be the desired transformation at Tsinghua? And then how does that relate and influence the development of communication schools elsewhere in China? Another question which I think relates in a certain sense to debates here in the United States is what are the loci of critical policy-related discussions in communications in society? So I know, again, Annenberg has been involved in this through Compass, etc., which is how do you transform a communication school so that it's more engaged in policy issues? And since I come from law and law schools, I'm very familiar with institutions that are deeply engaged in these processes of change, including in the area of media and society. So one question I would have is the same kind of dichotomy or difference present in China. That is to say, and there have been some allusions to this, that is to say, where within China are important debates about communications in society. Are they in the communication schools? Are they in law faculties? Are they in departments of history, etc.? So, and are they organized in different ways in other kinds of institutes relating to civil society, etc.? And I've been fascinated also watching Dr. Hu and CUC to see a university which is, in a certain sense, organized around the question of communication. And does that lead to a different kind of transformation than other kinds of transformations, etc.? The final thing I just thought I'd say is that this goes to the issue of the last question, I suppose, of is there a difference between American communication schools research and Chinese communications research schools? I've been interested in thinking about whether there are some differential ideologies that allow differentiation. I mean, at the conference on India that Dayatusu was kind enough to refer to, one of the scholars proposed a symposium on Gandhi and communications in India. An interesting question. The question is, can one think of models different from Hallan and Mancini? Can one think of archetypes that contribute to global discussion of communications policy that are different from neoliberal, North Atlantic, polarized, pluralism, etc.? etc. And I think there is room and there is a need for doing so without kind of reifying a model, but being able to reflect upon and build such a model from China, from India, etc. So my view is there are great areas for research. One of them is the researchers themselves, and the second is that there are potential and important differences between Chinese and Western schools of journalism and communication. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Price. So I would like to first invite our forum speakers to comment or raise questions. If you do, please use one of the mics on either side of the table. Maybe let me first follow up with the comment Professor Hu made at the end of your presentation, the from to question. And so the comment is about the destination of Chinese communication scholarship seems to be unclear or unknown. Is that? Do you want to elaborate a little bit on that? Or maybe I should clarify. Do we all agree on the origin? We all agree on the origin, where we start from.
My argument at the end of my presentation is that nowhere is not pessimistic. Nowhere, it's sort of optimistic because that means. To great extent in China right now, in terms of economy, many people and even the policymakers and the scholars got sort of what I should translate that 自觉, self-conscious. That means probably in terms of according to Chinese economic experience, probably we can do something do some own research by ourselves with our terminologies, paradigms, and try to create new theories and so on. But for communication research, it's still not this at this stage. It's before this stage, sort of this kind of terminology building up and theories building up stage or phrase. So that's my argument.
Yes, Daya. Could you pass that?
Thank you. It's more of a comment rather than a question. And it refers to Professor Monroe Price's comments. It was actually me who mentioned about Gandhi at the Chicago pre-conference. And the reason I mentioned that was because I was in Ahmedabad in Western India earlier this year. I was invited there by Mudra Institute of Communication, which is one of the leading schools in India, a private school. And the person who was hosting me, she took me to the museum where Gandhi lived. Gandhi ashram is there. And I asked her, you are in the city of Gandhi, why don't you do something on Gandhi and communication, and not just as a political communicator, because he was an extremely clever spin doctor. He knew how to use the media. But also a first-rate thinker in terms of development communication. And I raised that question with the faculty there. I said, why do you use Daniel Lerner's work? Why don't you look out at Gandhi's work? There are, 10 volumes of his work. He was the greatest journalist India ever had. He wrote in 2 languages, and his words were read by millions of people across the subcontinent. So it's not, the point I'm trying to make is there is a structural issue here. Most of what passes for communication studies is imported largely from the United States. If you look at the 4 theories of the press book, for example, it's been used for courses in media and communication across the globe. Although we could have our views about its validity as a core text, but it is used. So it's a question of power. The discipline developed in the U.S. and it's not surprising that U.S. textbooks and U.S. paradigms are dominant, even in countries like China, where as Zhao mentioned, the kind of work she is doing is still of a very, very small minority interest. And I think that's problematic, not just in China, but everywhere. Thanks.
Dan? Yes.
Whether you think...
Do I need these mics?
I'd like to ask, Professor Zhao, whether you think the proliferation of surveillance technology throughout the world, including China, needs to be integrated in communication studies, because there are a lot of points in your book, your newest book, Communication in China, where you really, in a fascinating way, use Foucauldian concepts to think about China. So I wonder if you could do some of that here for us, please.
Actually, my answer to your first part is definitely surveillance. Actually, up at Simon Fraser, I have colleagues, a number of colleagues doing surveillance research. They will take students, actually, to Vancouver and count the cameras. And also, the interesting thing is they also apply kind of cultural studies, active audience framework to that. That is how people resist against that camera when it's there, what they behave, like the active audience theory. So I think that I totally agree with you that is a tremendous, very interesting area of research, and it has to be incorporated into Chinese communication research more than beyond the internet. And I think that is a very important area. Yeah.
Can I have one in first and then?
I just want to echo one of the points that Yuezhi made about the Chinese scholars' reaction against the over-politicization, because in my interaction with the Chinese scholars based in China, I also have detected a similar sentiment, and I think that's a very important development, and we need to be quite careful and thoughtful about how to approach this. And I think I don't really see that a reaction on sort of against the over-politicization as a sign of the Chinese scholars having internalized this, ideological sort of, system. Or nor do I see that as a sign of that the fact that they fear getting into trouble or anything. I see this as also actually one of the manifestations of the rising nationalism. And this is compounded by the fact that when the Chinese scholars sit in this kind of forum, but do not necessarily have enough English to communicate with English-speaking scholars at a similar wavelength, and yet they have brilliant ideas and very valid thoughts, and that's at the point where it becomes really, really tricky, then a lot of people are just saying, why bother going to this kind of place, because we don't actually have the English to express that kind of thing. And so, and they also tend to look at some of the Chinese problems from, very, very fixed lens anyway. They're trying to over-politicize. They have got their own little POW sort of paradigm or whatever. So I think we should be aware of that, because we might potentially run the risk of actually stopping the exchange rather than actually opening that or keeping it open.
Yeah, just very briefly to sort of maybe also supplement that idea. It's an observation and also a comment. I think it's sort of also respond to what Professor Hu was saying earlier. Is like starting from somewhere and going nowhere. Because another thing I found quite interesting, either by talking with, for example, visiting scholars who go to Western institutions, or when I go back to China to talk with media scholars in China, oftentimes I would be asked this question, that is, what's the newest concept, or what's the newest theory, or what's the newest trend in media communication West, in media and communication research in the West. For example, right now we have these visiting scholars in our department from a very prestigious Chinese university. She kept asking me this question because she is supposed to write a report when she goes back. That is, what's the newest concept or theoretical framework we can use. So I think yes, on one hand there is this problem with maybe the very Western-centric view, and also the language barrier in terms of bringing out and introducing more quality research from Chinese scholars. But also on the other hand, the other side of the coin, that is, there is also this kind of anxiety among Chinese scholars when they think about how to talk about China with Westerners, and they're so eager to sort of fit everything about China into the so-called newest theory or newest trend in communication research in West. And I never had a good answer for this kind of question, that is, what's the newest trend in communication research.
John? Sure. I can't resist, because many years ago I constantly being asked this question. So you know what I answer? I said, even Western scholars do not produce new theories every other day. The other is, why do you think that newest theory is more relevant to China? I think I said, right now, for example, what's going on in the US during the progressive era, or what's going on in the UK during the rise of capitalism is more the kind of stuff that's being researched is more interesting. E.P. Thompson's Making of English Working Class is more interesting. So that's my answer. I don't know if that's useful, but I know this is such a pity. But then again, speaks about the derivative nature of Chinese communication research. And again, the attempt to catch up with what's the newest theory rather than look at Chinese problems, like the kind of problem I'm talking about earlier about the urban-rural divide, that kind of thing. And that is how, the need to publish in Western journals, the need to be evaluated in certain terms. And so it's not just, this is a choice of individual scholars, but it's the entire academic machine right now that's being built. Yeah, the culture, but also the uneven exchange. No matter how much China, has tried to project soft power, but right now it's still this kind of situation.
It's kind of interesting that I cannot resist making a comment on that one as well, because in China, especially in the so-called elite universities like Fudan University, Zhejiang University, and so on, getting things published in some Western journal, right, would bring you financial reward, significant financial reward, right, in the form of bonuses and in the form of just extra opportunities for research fund, right? So as you can see, that's very problematic. And interestingly enough, this publishing or perishing model now in China is implemented, enforced by the state. So that's something to examine. And I have a couple of comments after listening to this group, and I can notice that the structural transformation of Chinese communication reminds me the famous title, The Structural Transformation of the Public Sphere, but the problem is the bourgeois public sphere. The problem is that that bourgeois public sphere might be historical fiction. We don't know what it is exactly. Maybe something is happening over here. So we're talking about Chinese communication in terms of what? What is Chinese communication? And before we know that, how can we talk about the structural transformation? I think Professor Hu's presentation really gave us a very clear overview of all the structural changes that are taking place. But I can't help notice one thing, that is, in all these structural transformations, what is conspicuously absent is any kind of institutional venue for the purpose of articulating the objectives and paths toward establishing the institutional values for interest formation, interest articulation. In other words, there is no discussion, no possibility created for formal discussions on the democratization of the media system. So that's one thing I note. And while talking about this, and I sort of reacted in some way to Professor Meng's comment. The democratization project is too narrow, too outdated in some way for us to understand what is happening in China. And my sort of reaction is that, well, that's, as you pointed out correctly, it's probably under that kind of project, too much focus is on the formal politics, regime change, political institution change, not enough focus on the really important issues. And I like, in particular, Professor Zhao's characterization, this urban-rural divide, and this intellectual bias in our scholarship toward urban and coastal regions. I am guilty on that. All right? And I am also guilty in privileging the elite resistance, not the other forms of resistance. So what gets neglected in this democratization project, it's not that democratization is not laudable historical project. It's not important research agenda. Rather is the neglect of all the important things that really constitute democratization. So I just want to make those quick comments.
Thank you, Pan. Stan, please.
I was very interested in Vice President Hu's presentation. He started off talking about the importance of insider accounts, learning what's really going on. Well, that's difficult for a Westerner. He's nay, I'm Y. You know, he's an insider, I'm an outsider. And since I don't want to be accused of investigating state secrets, how far can a Westerner do the kind of research which you're advising people to do if they want to really find out what's going on? But also in terms of structural transformation, this gets to this kind of a question. One important question for me, and I'll talk about it briefly tomorrow, would be research on the kind of interministerial battles over turf. Now, Susan Shirk wrote about this back in 1984 when China was opening to the outside world, and all of a sudden light industry goods, consumer goods were important. Who controls washing machines when they become important? And you end up fighting over one ministry with more power gets the multi-cycle machines, another ministry with less power loses control and only has the simple machines. Looking at it in culture, it's an interesting question. For example, most recently, the very popular online game World of Warcraft, there's a big turf battle going on between, as you know, the Ministry of Culture, which is more liberal, and the Press and Publications Administration over whether to ban this or not. And you see this in the film industry with SART, or the Guangdianbu, controlling theatrical films, the Ministry of Culture having control over home video. There's a lot of bargaining, a lot of negotiation going on. I've looked at the decision to allow Lust Caution to play theatrically in China, despite the sex, the violence, and the anti-patriotism of the theme. after Ang Lee cut out about 8 minutes of it, or the decision to allow Rolling Stone to have a Chinese edition in March 2006 and all the problems that led to, which has now disappeared, Rolling Stone. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about how, particularly a foreigner, can go about researching those kinds of questions.
Yeah, and for this online games case, or many people can understand this from the coverages published on Chinese media and international media. For example, like I really want to give you the other example is also online case. At the very beginning of this year, a government official in Shenzhen 海事局局长, and according to that online report, that this government official sexually harassed a little girl when he got drunk and asked this girl where is the restroom and so on and so on. And this case got so heavily, focused or concentrated, not only from online but also from conventional media. But the very interesting thing is the truth is not that case. And the reason for this to become so popular, to become so influential, is just because of this girl's parents. And this caused parents, to buy those Wu Mao Dang and to post all of those, bloggers and posts online and so on to stir up this kind of case and, try to blame, this kind of stuff. Because the government officials has so bad reputation generally in China. So that's why the online citizens or netizens got so angry about this and so on. And even the Deng Yujiao's case this year. So if you just understand this case and say, okay, China is also already democracy and democratizing itself, but with a lot of control from the government, and you will find this case is very, very interesting. But after you understanding the truth of Deng Yujiao's case, it's not the case of democratization, it's the case of social justice. Who can protect the social justice and social case? So it's not democratization and so on. So it's my suggestion is if you really want to do this kind of stuff, and of course you need to get to the insider contact. For example, like first-hand interview, of course, personally and privately. That's much more significant to understand the very backdoor, stories and reasons. And in many cases, for this case, online games, cultural ministry, and that conflicts. Actually, many of those kind of policy changes, not just happened not because of the organizational consideration, just because of personal consideration and my personal political performance and so on. But what kind of real reason for his personal consideration? If you have no contact with this policymaker, you have no idea about that. Probably people would make the judgment and said, okay, this is just because of public issues, try to protect public interests and so on and so on. But out of my personal and private reason. So it's in this sense, it's very complicated, Depends on the Chinese 关系. Yeah, exactly. Depends on the quality of the 关系. And if you are close enough and you are very intimate enough, yes, they would like to tell you about that, of course, back in the dark room. But if you just have this kind of regular 关系, yes, okay, very 冠冕堂皇. Yes, that's
then
true.
You can't publish it anyway.
Yeah,
okay.
Okay. Maybe they were told you it's not available for published, but it should be help you to understand what's happened.
Yeah.
Background
the background and the hiding inside.
参考价值.
Well, and I think it's very important for your research.
We're going to spend 7 or 8 minutes more on this discussion. Tom, do you have a comment?
Yes, thank you. This has been a wonderful discussion. I
was especially struck by the comment about the urban-rural, which of course is a huge conflict in the United States and in many other developed as well as developing nations. But I was also struck by a kind of a parallel issue that emerges. China loves to refer to itself as a developing nation, but in the eyes of much of the world, China has already become a wealthy nation. And so it's increasingly encountering resistance and anxiety from people who feel that they can no longer compete. It was a huge story in U.S. politics, the anxiety about jobs lost to China. It's become a huge story in Taiwan that those who are calling for independence are primarily people who are most threatened by the exodus of Taiwanese jobs to the mainland. It's clearly marking the competition between India. There was a story recently about Indonesia. So I'm curious, particularly as you think about these rural, urban kinds of issues, if you can also put them in the framework of the competition for global work, global population migrations that are occurring, and how they impact the work that people who study communication in China might be engaged in.
Thank you very much, actually. Can I respond
Just
to that?
briefly.
Yeah. Well, also, it's in that kind of context, I think we should look at, the China rising discourse, and especially the urban middle class. Actually, they feel, of course, China's rising. It's comparison, the idea of Indian shines, right? But then only shines for some people. And in China, I think there's a backlash now because the urban middle class do feel China rising. The scholars do feel China rising. Their patriotism get aroused. And also, Professor Hu is saying that some scholars Chinese scholars study, postmodern problems in a pre-modern society. Well, some of those scholars are postmodern in their lifestyle. And if you look at, the Shanghainese, they are postmodern. So in that sense, don't you agree? So I think there is that politics, and I think it's the bias actually has an impact in terms of the global discourse about China.
Okay, thank you. This is also about the rural-urban divide, and I obviously agree with you that this is an important dimension in the Chinese case, but I would suggest that maybe it's not quite as simple as that, because within the urban environment there are clearly very, very sharp differentiations, and the Shanghai, or even more clearly the Pearl River Delta, is a clear example of where there is sharp social differentiation inside the city. And secondly, I believe there are some moves towards allowing the sale of land, the private ownership of land. And if the history of, for example, the Soviet Union in the 1920s is anything to go by, that will result in a very, very rapid social stratification in the countryside between rich peasants and poor peasants, between landless labourers and landlords. So yes, you're right to say let's find out what sense the peasants make of all this. But I think that we have to be sensitive to the fact that the actual I don't like the term non-antagonistic contradictions. I mean, that's a Maoist term, and I'm not a Maoist. And never have been a Maoist. Unlike many people of my generation, I can say that I was never a worshipper at the shrine of Mao Zedong. I don't like the idea of non-antagonistic contradictions. I think that the potential of conflicts, the factory conflict, the beating to death of the factory manager who is about to sack thousands of people and had taken a huge bonus himself, was an urban conflict in the sense it's factory workers, not peasants. So I think that yes, let's shift from thinking about the urban elite, but there's an urban underclass, and there will pretty soon be a rural elite.
Thank you, Colin. I would like to invite one or two questions from the audience for the rest of the remaining time we have. Anybody has a question or comment for this panel? First the rest of, and then Pan. Okay. Anybody? If no? Oh, yes, please. Mm-hmm.
Institute, but I'm currently based here. I'm really not an expert or doing any research in this Chinese communication. I'm from Taiwan originally, but I have been here in the United States longer than I have been in Taiwan. I'm just wondering that does any of you foresee in the near future, 5 years, 10 years, that mainland China will open up its how you say, regulation or government policy for, like in Taiwan a couple of years ago, like 报警, open up for everybody to, if they want to have a media, whether it's newspaper or whether it's radio. Do you foresee that? And what is the current major obstacles that facing China? Thank you.
Okay, thanks for the question. Very briefly, anyone wants to take up this and to look into the crystal ball? Professor Hu, you want to say something?
It's quite different. So so in my view, that it's different. It's a different way, you know.
All right. Jack, you want to answer this question? Yeah.
Also a comment. Actually, I've been thinking about this. You know, most of the discussion in this panel so far has been that we can predict the transformation of China. Okay, can be piecemeal, can be radical, can be progressive, can be regressive, or maybe in different areas. But there's exactly that question still haunting me. Is it fundamentally predictable? You know, the hard lessons we are learning from, study of the Soviet Union is nobody predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union, right? And by the time, and if we look at the discussion of China's rise now, it's much more in sync with the 1980s discussion of Japan's rise. Who could predict Japan entered into the Heisei stagnation, starting from the early 1990s? Nobody could. So I think there's a fundamental sense of humility, that we need to bear in mind all these lessons in the past. Of course, China is too smart to repeat the same lessons. That's why they're not allowing the yuan to increase price so quickly like the Japanese yen. And however, what will be I think if we go back to your question, it has to do with whether the Communist Party, the party state, can sustain its power, okay, and that will be contingent upon whether the Chinese economic bubble will burst, this year or next year or the year after, right? So if all these contingent, if the economic bubble bursts, if the Communist Party bursts, right, then it will happen within 5 years or 10 years. Otherwise, I think there's always this contingency there. That's if the economy can sustain its growth and the Communist Party can sustain Y, right? The Jiang Qingguo, in 1988, the Kuomintang in the 1988 is very different an era. Then there's no need for opening up the press ban, for the Communist Party. But if the Communist Party is no longer there, of course, anything can happen. And that's the fundamental unpredictability, which Dan Schiller wrote about in 2005.
Thanks, Jack. Ernie, you want to make a comment? Yes.
The conversation about the predictability thing. The conversation about the predictability of or the ability to understand a transformation and how difficult that is calls to mind a vast quantity of scholarly work that's been done on the transition in East and Central Europe. And there are variables like the relationship between the elite and the mass, issues of pre-existing culture, issues of direct foreign investment. And I wonder the extent to which just thinking about the current Chinese transition and the role of the media in that transition draws upon or does not draw upon essentially now 20 years or so, 20 years of the Velvet Revolution that we saw in East and Central Europe, or whether that is a distinct discourse that is not drawn upon by Chinese scholars.
I think the answer
Yeah.
is in
Yes.
Ms. Collins' paper.
No.
So much for effective communication.
You want to just very
Well, just very quickly, I think the Chinese Hu Jintao can quote you a statement made by Hu Jintao, precisely drawing a lesson on that. And that actually part answers the question you raised. That is, if the Communist Party in power, they are not going to allow the liberalization press and the lift of ownership for private ownership, because they learned a lesson. That's what happened in the Soviet Union. And Hu Jintao had a statement somewhere in one of my papers.
Susan, yes.
I guess the way we originally answered that question, Jack, was about the regime change in China. But actually, I think the change in the licensing system could occur without regime change in China, and that it would actually be quite consistent with some of the steps toward greater marketization of the media system. So I recognize how important the licensing system is in the system of control. But given how much money is involved in all of this stuff now, and I think Stan's question about the bureaucratic conflicts was premised on the notion that there's a lot at stake here. I guess my prediction was I think they may modify that system at least and make it more transparent and make it more fair and increase the number of licenses, which of course I believe they've continuously been doing. So I think that could change. In fact, I think I would put my money on, I think it will change.
You want to say very quickly?
I remain sort of an optimist because so many things have changed that a lot of times they wise up and end up doing the right thing because it works better for them to do that.
Thank you, Susan. And we'll hear more from Susan and others tomorrow. And I have to end the session now since there's a shuttle bus taking all of our guests back to the hotel at 6 p.m. A couple of other housekeeping matters. Please make sure you bring your name tag back tomorrow. And for those staying at the hotel at Hilton, tomorrow morning, it's the shuttle bus is going to leave at 7:15. 7:15. All right. Okay. Thank you all very much for attending, and thank you all to the panelists for a wonderful discussion. See you all tomorrow.
Also, I was going to say, in whose interest is deregulation pointing to? Because, like, if I talk with